Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this week's webinar, Down But Not Out, the response of student employers to COVID-19. Today's webinar is being led by our Chief Research Officer, Tristram, and Gabi, who is the Research and Policy Manager at AGCAS. Also, this session is being recorded, so you can rewatch it again later and share it with your colleagues who may be interested. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so if you have any questions for our panelists, please leave them in the question box as we go along, and I will feed them in at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, over to you, Tristram and Gabi.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm Tristram Hooley, I'm Chief Research Officer at the ISE, and we're going to be talking today about this new piece of research that we've done. It came out yesterday, so you're really hearing it sort of straight up, and it was done by the ISE of our membership, but also we were supported by AGCAS. So Gabi, would you just like to introduce yourself and say a little bit about AGCAS?
Sure, so I'm Gabi, I'm Policy and Research Manager at AGCAS. We are the professional membership organisation for university careers services and careers professionals. So we're kind of experts in careers, student and graduate careers and employability and their career development. And it was really important for us to be able to support the ISE on this piece of research, and I'll talk about that in just a second.
Great. So this fits into a kind of range of work that the ISE have been doing on COVID-19. So we've got a COVID-19 hub. So if you're interested in kind of keeping up with the latest information, then please just kind of head straight to our hub. It's on our main homepage. You can just get there from there. But we've also been producing a number of different publications, and in a way this is a follow-up to a piece that we did really right at the beginning of the crisis, where we went out to employers and said, well, what do you think is happening? What are some of the impacts of the crisis? We've also been producing other things like an employer's guide to COVID-19. We've done work with suppliers and so on. And then we're producing a regular weekly bulletin. Number 8 has just come out. Number 9 will come out in the next couple of days. And that's really a weekly roundup of all the news and data and policy action that happens around COVID-19. So we really believe that this crisis has got really very profound impacts for the student labour market. And so we're really trying to keep very much on top of it.
And from the AGCAS perspective, we've spent a lot of time over the last few months talking to our members and talking to heads of service about the challenges that they're facing in their career services and in their wider universities. And what we found, particularly from an all members survey that we recently researched and analysed, was that the #1 concern for our members over the coming months was the availability of up-to-date LMI. Our members need to know what employers are doing so that they can make their plans to suit them, and also to make sure their students are supported properly. So what we've been doing over the last couple of months, and what we're going to continue to do, is put out resources to our members around the topics that are important to them. So we've had a series of webinars already that are all open access on our website to members. So covering things like how to deliver careers guidance virtually, but with a real focus around the graduate labour market and what the future might look like. We've also got coming up quite a few member-led activities and resources, so particularly by our Employee Engagement Task Group, and we'll be dedicating a day of our alternative conference in June to looking at the impact of the crisis on the graduate labour market. So it was really important to us as an organisation to respond to what our members want and to get involved with supporting the ISE in this piece of research so that we can better support our students.
Great, so this is what we're going to try and cover over the next sort of half an hour or so, and then hopefully there'll be a bit of chance for people to ask questions. If you want to ask questions as we go along, then please do just type them into the question box, and we'll try and get through as many of them as we can towards the end. Let's start off by just telling you a little bit about the study. So we've already said it's a study done by the ISE with AGCAS supporting us, and it was open from Monday the 20th of April to Monday the 4th of May. So if you remember back, that's just about that period when it started to become clear that we were moving out of the kind of really hard phase of lockdown. Now, as it's happened. It's not been perhaps quite as big a move from that as we might have thought, but I think it was starting to become apparent at that point. So it's a very different set of data than the data that we had back in the beginning, middle of March when we did our last survey. We had 179 responses. Most of them were ISE members, and most of them were large employers, but not all, which allows us to do a bit of breakdowns, as we'll show you later on. They also break down across a range of different sectors, and we've got the normal sectors that we look at in the ISE. We've also added in or sort of pulled out health and pharmaceuticals because we thought that might be different from how we've seen it in other research that we've done. We had a good geographical breakdown. So this slide tells us where in the country the different firms who responded to our survey are active, and so we can see that in pretty much every region or every country of the UK, we've got a fifth of our sample are active in Northern Ireland, but around about a third plus in every other country or region. So it's a pretty good sample in terms of its geographical bias as well. So let's get onto some of the meat of the survey. The first thing we want to look at is staffing implications. So one of the big changes that we've seen in the current period is the creation of the furlough scheme. So firms can put their staff on furlough, so essentially temporarily pause their employment. Government's picking up 80% of their salaries for the moment. We've heard recently that this is going to continue in some form until the end of October. So it's quite an important part of this of the labour market, particularly in the period at which students are leaving education this year. So in our sample, on average, firms were furloughing about 13% of their staff, which is probably a little below average, and probably has something to do with the sectoral makeup of our staff. And on average, they were also furloughing about 14% of their early career staff. So that was interesting. We were interested to see whether there was going to be a big difference, whether, for example, firms were overwhelmingly furloughing new entrants to the labour market, but it doesn't seem to be that that's happening. There is a slight tendency for firms to furlough early career staff, but not very marked. However, there are some big sectoral differences, with furloughing a particular issue in the built environment, energy, engineering and industry, and retail and fast-moving consumer goods sectors. And the furlough, oh, sorry, yes. You come in.
Sorry, Tristram. It's also quite important to note that furloughing of staff is also indirectly affecting early careers recruitment. So when we asked firms whether they'd reneged on offers or if they'd delayed or stalled their recruitment, about 10% who had said this was due to concerns that they didn't feel able to support their new hires, particularly because their staff were going on furlough. It's also affecting how firms are engaging with education providers. So many employers asked for patience from education providers, particularly schools and colleges, over the upcoming months, because they have members of their staff on furlough and just aren't able to keep up with engaging with those schools and colleges. But on the other hand, one of the biggest challenges for employers working with apprenticeship providers at the moment is difficulties retaining contact with them, often because of furlough as well. So it has a bit of a multifaceted impact on the recruitment and development of early careers talent.
Great. So furloughing then is a big issue, but what we're sort of primarily interested in here is hiring of new students, bringing new graduates and apprentices and so on into the labour market. And what we can see in this figure is that in all categories, so non-graduates, which includes our school leavers and apprentices, graduates, and then these short-term interns and placement students, in all categories, we're seeing an overall reduction in the number of hires that firms are planning to make this year. And that's a reduction from their original plan. So what they were hoping to recruit this year, and what they now, towards the end of the sort of first phase of the crisis in April, early May, where they'd got to by that point. And what we can see is that there's a fairly substantial drop in all of these. So for non-graduates, we're seeing in larger firms around about 30%, dropping, I think it's 32%. For graduates, it's 12% drop. And for interns and placement students, we're seeing a 40% drop in recruitment. And those figures are much bigger for small and medium-sized enterprises. And that is something that is concerning for all of us, because obviously lots of people do work for small and medium-sized enterprises. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about changes by sector. We've also in the report broken those changes down by sector, and as you can see, there are some quite big variations. As perhaps is unsurprising, health and pharmaceuticals is the only area where we see any increases, and that's for them, it's in the non-graduate section. But there are some quite different impacts. One of the things that's, I think, important is that we're seeing in general bigger impacts for non-graduates, so for apprentices, than for graduates. And as you can see a little bit from this slide, that is partly due to non-graduates, well, to employers sort of preferring graduates to non-graduates, but it's also partly to do with the sectoral distribution of those non-graduates versus graduates. So there are some sectors where you find non-graduates more, others where you find graduates more, and in those cases it tends to be the sectors where non-graduates are located tend to be the ones that are having the bigger impact from COVID-19. In terms of reneging on job offers, about 14% of respondents reported that they'd already reneged on a job offer. So I think this is important because in general, our employers don't like reneging on job offers, and they would prefer to stop recruiting. So to honour all of the people that they've already given or made offers to, and but then to stop recruiting additional numbers. And that's where the majority of the kind of reduction in numbers is coming from. As you can see here, when you dig a bit further into the reneges, there are some higher renege rates in certain sectors. They're not particularly surprising sectors, so the built environment, retail and fast-moving consumer goods. SMEs are a little bit less likely to have reneged on offers, probably because their recruitment processes are a bit shorter. Looking forward, there are 14% of firms who are also considering the possibility of reneging on more offers. So they haven't done it yet, but they might do it going forward. So that's, again, concerning. But at the moment, we're not seeing reneges as a particularly big part of the picture. It's much more likely to be that employers are slowing down or stopping existing recruitment. If we look forward to next year, we've got much less clarity. So although we've got a pretty good idea about where employers are going to end up this year, obviously there's still a number of months before hires really start, so the changes are still possible. But when we say, well, okay, how are you going to be recruiting in the 2020-21 cycle, we see that there's a very large proportion of employers who are still telling us we don't really know yet. On balance, you know, those who do know, more of them are saying, well, we'll do about the same as this year, but the proportion who are recruiting less is larger than the proportion who are recruiting more. So I think we would expect that the graduate labour market would probably continue, or the student labour market would continue to shrink next year, but there's a lot of uncertainty in this still.
And we asked firms to explain their reasons why they'd reneged offers or changed their plans to their recruitment of early careers and students and graduates. And the number one reason that came up time and time again was uncertainty, just not knowing what the economy is going to look like. And this accounted for just under 40%. Across both SMEs and large employers, the desire to protect current staff and to not lose any staff that they already have, or to bring staff back on furlough, was a concern for both, and one of the reasons why they'd perhaps recruited lower numbers or reneged on offers. SMEs are also more likely to change their recruitment plans because of the financial impact on their business. So in terms of profit, turnover, work, or funding in the case of charities and public sector organisations. And large employers were more concerned about their ability to support new hires. So there was a little bit of divergence between the SMEs and the corporates' reasons for changing their recruitment plans.
Okay, so if we move on to look at the hiring process itself. So far we've really looked at overall numbers, and as we've seen, things are down, but as we've said in the kind of title of this presentation, we're saying it's down but not out. We're still seeing recruitment. There are still opportunities, but the number of opportunities has definitely reduced. But how is the hiring process actually shifting? Well, during the kind of lockdown period, what we saw was a lot of things being cancelled, and particularly stuff that was more around the recruitment and attraction side of things. So work experience, careers fairs, insights and open days, those things were kind of more likely to be cancelled. And then we saw some activities, so particularly the sort of recruitment and selection activities like interviews and assessment centres shifting online. And so we've seen a very big shift in the way employers are organising their recruitment processes so far. But we wanted to look forward, and we asked them to think about where they were going to be in the autumn. And what we can see from this is that there's a kind of quite a pattern really of people starting to move stuff online. Employers are still planning to carry on with the majority of the things that they were doing, so that the numbers that are reduced or cancelled have really dropped right down in terms of the autumn. So we're seeing some things planned to happen face to face, but an awful lot online and telephone activities. So I kind of analysed this a little bit further. So what this slide does is all of the people who were clear on what they were doing, because actually I've just popped back to that last slide. There's quite a number on here who weren't sure exactly what they were doing, or don't do some of these activities, which makes it a little bit more complicated to kind of pass what's going on. So what I did here was take all of the employers who do deliver one of these types of activities and who do know what they're planning to do in the autumn, and basically code it in one of three ways. So either they're planning to do it face to face, or they're planning to do it remotely, so that could be by telephone or online, or they're using some kind of combination of the two. And what we can see is that there has been a very substantial shift online. And in fact, the majority of the activities are now, the balance of delivery will now be online. So if you're an employer, you're probably, when you're doing recruitment and selection activities, when you're going out and trying to attract students, you're probably doing that online, or perhaps with some limited face-to-face activity, or you're planning to do that. There are some areas where people are more committed to trying to do it face-to-face, and so really these areas of careers fairs, where there's still quite a lot of interest in whether this can carry on face-to-face, running various kinds of business games and enterprise competitions, and then obviously work experience, which is very difficult to deliver online, although as we'll look at later, some employers are going to be doing this. I think one of the questions here is whether this this experience that we're seeing in the autumn kind of carries on beyond that, really.
And interestingly, we gave employers the opportunity to comment on their recruitment processes and how they might differ looking forwards. And whilst there were some employers who stated that they'd like to return to face-to-face activities like careers fairs, the majority within the comments, within the qualitative data, actually expect to retain much of their virtual recruitment processes and their attraction as well. And they mentioned benefits such as less cost to them in terms of going to places, expenses, that they're popular with students, and also virtual methods allow them to reach students that they wouldn't normally engage with in a face-to-face way.
Great, so we're now going to move on to talk about how employers would like education providers to engage with them.
Yep, so we asked employers to just say how they'd like schools and colleges and then universities and HE providers to engage with them over the crisis and forwards. And in terms of engaging with schools and colleges, a third of firms would like schools and colleges to engage with them as they normally do, but actually a small minority would prefer that that contact is paused. And there were different answers within this question from employers. So some would like this contact to be paused just for the summer until they kind of have a better sense of what they're doing in the autumn. But others said, we don't want to be contacted until 2021, or we will contact schools and colleges when we're ready. So there's a bit of difference within that. Employers want to maintain their normal channels of communication with schools and colleges, and overwhelmingly this is email and other online channels, so keeping it quite simple. However, within that, there are a significant number of employers who want to explore digital ways of engaging with students via schools and colleges. And 10% of employers who answered this question stated that they'd want to do more virtual stuff, whether it is virtual webinars with students or contacting them over Zoom and other technologies. And 10% doesn't sound like a lot, but this was an optional question where employees could write about anything they wanted to. So actually it is a significant number. But there were also a significant number of employers who stated that anything that they did with schools and colleges, they'd have to have a lot of notice for, as it's something that they'd need to build into their plans to make sure that they were able to do this properly. And so that's something that schools and colleges need to be aware of. And then in terms of engaging with universities, so more firms are keen to maintain engagement with universities, so 71%. And respondents were asking for clarity on when students were going to be back on campus, what assessment and qualification might look like, how they can get in touch with students, etc. However, within that 71%, 3/4 of those firms were large employers. Only a quarter of SMEs wanted to maintain engagement with universities. And they were more likely to want to pause things for now and kind of pick up contact later. So large employers were much more likely to want a regular contact or updates as soon as possible. And I think what this kind of shows is the large corporates have obviously got milk rounds on their minds in the autumn recruitment process. And what we found for SMEs, particularly within the reflection section that we'll come on to later, is perhaps their minds are on the kind of more day-to-day business survival and success than recruitment at the moment. Within this question, a lot of firms reported that they wanted higher education providers to take the lead and create new ways for them to engage with students. So I hate this term, but firms are looking for oven-ready solutions. They want universities to make decisions about careers fairs and new ways of virtually contacting students now, and to provide them with opportunities that they can just pick up and run with. But it has to be mentioned on the flip side that universities are struggling with the same uncertainty that employers are. Career services may not know when or if students will be back on campus, what teaching and assessment might look like. So it's important to state that both parties have to be quite patient with one another, and we're all kind of feeling our way through this. If career services do create innovative and creative solutions for employers to engage with their students, there's obviously a key role there for employers to make sure that they're supporting those activities and seeing the value in them. They might not be face-to-face, but that doesn't mean that they won't be of high value and quality and allow that engagement with students to continue.
Great. So I'll say a little bit now about the process of managing and developing students, and particularly about the idea of induction as well, which is something which I think is quite an important thing that students are likely to be quite concerned about. So around a third of our employers are saying that they're anticipating delaying the start date, with another third still kind of undecided. So I mean, this varies quite a lot. Different employers will induct people at different points, and inductions may start anytime from July through to normally September. Some can be rolling, some can be all in one. So it's difficult to get a kind of very clear picture of this, but just having a quick look at the kind of dates that people were saying, this figure that you can see here, it organizes it by what was most common. So the larger things, so September and October were the most commonly stated dates when people were thinking about pushing back their start date too. But you've also got a small number of employers who are talking about pushing them back much further, so into 2021, for example. So that's one of the big things, that even for those students who have successfully got a job, they may not be in a position to start face-to-face physically within the office or environment that they're going to be working with straight away, and they may find that their start date gets pushed back. Alternatively, around about half of employers are planning to induct staff remotely. And so it may be that you start a job and on your first day you don't go into the office, but you actually sit at your home desk, and you have to then log in and do your induction remotely. And we know from a lot of the conversations we've been having with employers that they're in the process of planning exactly how to do this at the moment. So induction is likely to be changed by the crisis. Hopefully for most people they will still be inducted and start. And this then is sort of played through into wider processes that are going on within employers. So many graduate schemes and all apprenticeships obviously have a very substantial amount of learning and development as part of their schemes. Most of our respondents anticipate that they'll deliver more of this or all of this online, that they won't be perhaps bringing new hires together into large groups as was common to do, but in fact we'll be delivering a lot of learning and development activities online. And almost all of our respondents are also reporting that they're providing some kind of health and well-being support during the lockdown, and I would guess that this is likely to go on longer as well. So we're seeing, this is where we get some indications of how the change that we've seen from COVID-19, it's making a difference in terms of the number of people who are employed. It's making a difference in terms of the recruitment processes, how they get employed, but it's also going to be making a difference in terms of the kinds of work and the way that the workplace actually operates. So Gabi, if you want to finish with a few reflections, that would be great.
Sure. So we asked employers to reflect on what had happened within their business over the last few months, and also to think about what they expected for the future. And we coded answers as to whether they were kind of broadly positive, negative, or neutral. And large employers were more likely to have positive reflections. So over 50% of the reflections from larger employers were positive. They spoke about new ways of working and how the crisis had actually catalysed a process that was happening quite gradually. So moving to home working, increased flexibility, more virtual recruitment, so things that they were already starting to think about. They also reflected on the fact that their business has had rapidly adapted to the crisis, and that their leadership had been quite strong, so good communication through the business and a focus on well-being. So all really positive things. Now for SMEs, less than a third of their reflections were positive, and actually 50% were negative. So the financial impact of COVID-19 on their business made up the biggest proportion of their negative reflections. And some SMEs are incredibly worried about their survival. There was a stark message that came out through those reflections for SMEs. In terms of the concerns facing employers for the future, both large employers and SMEs are concerned about the financial impact of the crisis on their organisation, and also the impact on their early career recruitment going forward. And that was particularly for larger employers. Many employers expect long-term changes to how they operate and revised plans for the future. So reduced working weeks, reduced business forecasts and growth, and worries about kind of how they'd expected the year to plan out versus how it was actually going to pan out. And there are also some sector differences in reflections. So just flicking onto the next slide, we had a look at the breakdown in those reflections by sectors, and this is both SMEs and larger employers together. And there were some significant differences. So firms within energy, engineering and industry were quite concerned about the return to normal post-lockdown. So worries about backlogs of growth, backlogs of work, and how to ensure that any new hires are trained and able to kind of continue with that work as soon as possible. So worries about the delay of training on the ability to carry on with that work. There's also concerns about how to capitalise on opportunities for growth. And I think this is quite an interesting point, because there are employers who see growth around the corner and are just not sure how they'll be able to jump on that without government support, etc. The financial impact was of the greatest concern to retail and FMCG firms, legal and financial and professional services. But there were also some interesting positive reflections. So particularly for the charity and public sector, the third most common reflection for them was that the crisis had highlighted the importance of their work. So whilst a lot of the reflections were negative and quite stark, there were positives in there as well, and things to capitalise on moving forward.
Great. So to summarise, I think the short-term picture is becoming quite clear. Student recruitment for this year is down but not out. Business processes have substantially moved online. So we're seeing lots of things that previously would have been done face-to-face are now being done online. Medium term, it's still a bit unclear. So recruitment numbers for next year, I think, are still being decided, but there are, I think, some worrying signs that we may see some decline in or ongoing decline in the size of the student labour market. And also many of these business processes that were moved online to kind of work around the lockdown, some of them at least look like they will be moving online for good. But I think we have to be honest and say we're still some way from establishing the new normal. So it's not clear what's going to happen at what point and how long some of these things go on for. But I think it's probably time for us to take a few questions, and some contact details for us if you would like here, but we'll probably shift to cameras now. And if anybody's got any questions that they want to ask about anything that we found, we're happy to give it a go and see if we can answer them.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tristram. Thank you, Gabi. Gabi, actually, the first question is for you. Janet was wondering if the AGCAS sessions are free or charged.
So the alternative conference is free to AGCAS members, and I'm pretty sure all of the webinars that I put on the second slide were also free to members as well. So provided you're an AGCAS member, you should have access to all of those.
Thank you. Tristram, can you confirm if the internship placements are for undergraduates, or are these for FE and school level 2?
No, so when we're asking about internships and placements, that's really looking at the university population. So mainly undergraduates, I think, but possibly some postgraduates in there as well. What we're not including in that would be things like the T levels, for example, which obviously we're interested in, but we haven't. I think that would require us another question, which we may start asking in the future. But yeah, no, so the internships are really higher education focused.
Thank you. Terry is asking, are there any regional trends apparent from this research?
Yeah, it's not very easy to see from the way that we've asked the questions. I have had a bit of a look at it and tried to kind of pick it out, but no, I think we can't really tell you that these factors are much worse in different areas of the country based on this data. Obviously, there is other data out there which will give you more of insights onto that.
Thank you. A number of employees have responded as intending to engage face-to-face in the autumn. So Tracy was wondering if you have any thoughts on managing expectations of employers regarding the likely limitations of universities to deliver face-to-face activities such as fairs.
Sounds like one for you, Gabi.
Yeah, I think each university will respond differently and at a kind of a different pace. I think my kind of advice to career services would be to just make those decisions as soon as you can and make sure that they're communicated quickly to employers. I don't know much more about how else to manage expectations because those decisions are still being made. but I expect the decisions will be made quite quickly over the next couple of months.
Thank you. Another question from Terry. Do you know how the UK grad market compares to other countries?
Not yet, but we are actually doing a piece of work on this. So it's very likely that in a month or so we will be running a webinar on this sort of lines, which will look at variations. I mean, we do know that there are some countries that have been through very similar kinds of processes to us. We've certainly got some data from Australia where we've got it's a very similar organisation to the ISE. But yeah, we'll come back to you with a bit more on that over the next month or so.
A question from Sash. If we are doing this session in 1 year, what will you both be saying, and what do you expect?
Well, I mean, we don't know is the honest truth as where we'll be in a year's time. But my guess is that we will be in a new normal by then. That there won't. I mean, a lot of the things that we're dealing with at the moment are really about dealing about rapid change and disruption to the way processes work. I would expect that side of things to have settled down quite a lot in a year's time. But my kind of current reading of things is that there's very likely to be a recession. And so I think it's very possible that next year we're still probably telling you that overall recruiting numbers are down and that the student labour market is somewhat depressed. But you know, we don't know, so that would be my kind of guess. I don't know, Gabi, would you have a different guess?
No, I'd probably echo that, but say I expect regional differences to be I expect there to be quite a few regional differences, and I think it's something that we need to kind of be looking forward to, how we can step in now and try and address those regional differences as best we can. But yeah, I don't know how great the picture is going to be in a year, but also I don't want to make those guesses because it is just too uncertain.
Thank you. A question from Paul. Can you remind us what the response survey rate was from employers, please?
So we had 179 responses from employers. We can't really give you a response rate as such because this was an open survey, so we went out wider than the ISE membership. So you know, that would be about half, or slightly over half the ISE membership, but it actually includes a number of firms that are not ISE members in there as well, although generally they're fairly similar in nature, although we have made an effort to try and include some SMEs. Obviously there's an almost infinite number of businesses that you could list, but yeah, this is based on data from 179 organizations.
Thank you. A question from Sue. Did employers make any mention of how they intend to ensure that students from disadvantaged groups are not going to be further disadvantaged in online recruitment processes or online inductions, etc.?
Did you pick any of that up in the qualitative data?
So in the qualitative data that we around how employers can work with universities, the kind of significant point around that is that employers want to be led by universities and told how they can engage with students that isn't going to be exclusive, that it will be in ways that are inclusive to students. And there are a few good quotes in there that I could have included in the report, but I didn't because there were quite a few of them saying, you know your students, you suggest to us how we can engage. So I think employers are again expecting universities to take the lead and tell them what they need to be doing. But I don't know if there was anything else within the quantitative data around that.
No, I mean, we didn't really ask a question about that, but I mean, what I can say is that from being in a lot of meetings with employers over the last couple of months, I think what many employers are very concerned about equality and diversity issues. They've done a lot of work on that. A lot of that work has been made a lot more difficult by the lockdown. And I think I have heard employers talking about it quite a lot, about how we're going to address some of these things. Also recognizing the idea of sort of digital inequality. So people who either don't have enough, don't have access to digital devices or good Wi-Fi, or who for whatever reason can't make good use of those, and that's a kind of new dimension of diversity. I think in our next survey we'll be digging into some of that a bit more, but yeah, I think generally at the moment employers recognise it to be a problem but aren't really sure what to do about it, hence the kind of comments that Gabi's picking up, which is they're looking for ideas from universities and other partners about how to address these issues.
Thank you. A question from Jack. What is the difference between an SME and a large employer, and how are they defined?
Yeah, so it's pretty straightforward. It's just, do you have more than 250 employees? We actually asked questions that would allow us to break down the employers into sort of slightly more refined groups, but the distinction between SME and large employer is a pretty established one, and so we just went with that in the end for the analysis. And as you can see, in a number of places it did demonstrate there were some quite big differences. But you can still be quite, relatively, you can be quite a big employer and still be classed as an SME if you employ 200 people. But if you employ 200 people, you probably aren't bringing in large numbers of students every year. You're probably just bringing in a handful.
Great, thank you. Moving on to the next question. This one's from Alison. Are many of the individual IC companies intending to make statements on their unique recruitment situation?
What, in terms of like publishing a statement saying we're not recruiting so many people? No, yeah, I think that's not very common that people will do that. I mean, those of you who've been watching the newspapers carefully will have spotted that there've been a couple of things where the newspapers have revealed that firm X or firm Y are saying that they've stopped recruitment or that they're reneging on some offers. But I think generally firms try and minimize how much of that really comes out, and that's why the data we have is useful, because we allow employers to tell us that in confidence, and we don't report it on individual firms.
Thank you. Alan is asking, did you get a sense that employers will be expecting the evidence and articulation of new flexible working and remote collaboration skills from students who have been proactive during the lockdown?
So not a huge sense. It's not something that we asked about, but it did come up in some comments that we expect students to be able to adapt to these working situations. And my sense from the data is that even when we are able to go back to face-to-face recruitment and back to more office-based working, things are never going to be quite the same. So students are going to need to be able to work in a remote environment and deal with virtual recruitment tools, even if employers are not kind of asking for them right now. So it wasn't something that we asked about, but my sense is yes.
Thank you. A question from Tonya. Given the potential reduction of on-campus face-to-face engagement students will have with employers, how do you think this will impact student confidence levels and employers being able to attract students from widening participation backgrounds?
I think it's an interesting one, because to be able to answer that question, we have to look at face-to-face interactions and think about how good they are for confidence of students from disadvantaged backgrounds as well. I think whatever recruitment and attraction activity you're using, we have to look at our students and graduates and try and make it as inclusive and increase their confidence for everything. So there will be some students who are much more comfortable engaging with employers in an online way compared to perhaps a massive careers fair or something like that. And then there will be students on the flip side. So I think it's something we have to keep looking at and keep analysing and asking those difficult questions of ourselves. Are these activities, are they exclusionary to any of our students? What can we do about that? And employers have to ask themselves the same question as well. So yeah, I don't think there's a simple answer.
I think that there is another more positive thing, Sarah, because I think a lot of what Gabi's just highlighted fits with that idea of the sort of digital inequality that we've talked about a little bit already. But I mean, there's another thing which is just very practical, which is at the moment employers have to make decisions about which universities to visit. And generally, not always, because we're seeing some employers who are questioning why they're visiting certain universities, but they tend to visit more elite institutions on the whole. And if we're no longer spending our time on campus, then it may be that actually there's some leveling elements to that as well, because it won't really matter so much which institution you were at if everybody's applying online. You won't. No one student who goes to a particular institution will have a better chance to have met an employer than any other. So, I mean, there are some potential positives to it, but obviously that all depends on how far employers are able to establish that kind of direct communication with young people, which is not always going to be easy, I think.
Thank you. Do you have a view on the apprenticeship take-up by sector from your survey, from our survey?
Yeah, I mean, there is some data in there which tells us where some of the impacts on apprenticeship are strongest. I mean, some of the data that we've got, what the data we've got is the proportion of change in each of those sectors. So that's what we've published in the slide that we showed earlier. That doesn't always reflect the overall numbers, because some sectors obviously are more committed to the apprenticeship route than others. But yeah, overall, I think we're quite concerned about apprenticeships. We think apprenticeships are probably going to fare worse than graduate recruitment. And you know, it's a question that I've been asking for a number of years, really, which is, when we get to a recession, are employers going to back graduates over apprentices? And you could argue either way. You could say, well, apprentices are cheaper, they're easier to mold into your organizational culture, and so on. But equally, you could say, well, graduates tend to be higher skilled, and so on. So far, and it is only 1 year's data, so far it looks like employers are backing graduates.
Trish is asking if there's any indication that London-based employers are disproportionately affected by COVID-19.
I don't have any data on that. No.
Okay. A question from Josh. Do you have any idea how many graduate recruitment contacts that have themselves been furloughed?
Well, all we know is the proportion of each of the graduate firms that are being furloughed. I mean, we know anecdotally, because through ISE, we're communicating with lots of people who are the key, essentially the graduate recruitment teams are usually one of our main contacts in firms, and we do know definitely that some of them have been furloughed. But yeah, I wouldn't be able to say as a total population of of graduate recruiters how many are on furlough, but it certainly is, there is a substantial number.
Thank you. Michelle is asking, was there any reference in the feedback to budgets or what employer expectations are around paying for online employer and student services?
Yeah, so in the qualitative data we got, employers looking forward, there were a number who stated that they were worried about their early careers recruitment because they will have lower budgets and uncertainty around budgets as well. None of these things were kind of set in stone, they were just their expectations of the future. And then one of the positives to come out of the switch to virtual recruitment and selection was the idea that it would be more cost effective. So again, we didn't ask employers specifically, but my sense is that they are going to have tighter budgets for those attraction campaigns, and perhaps virtual could prove beneficial in that way to them.
Thank you. 2 questions in one from John. If all campus events are moving online, would the recommendation be to up the number companies do or decrease them? And how prepared are the universities with their online propositions?
Shall I just say something about the numbers, and then perhaps you can say a bit more about where you think universities are? So, I mean, it's not the case that all campus events are moving online. That's what what we found was that there are actually some areas where there's a surprising commitment to continuing to do stuff face to face, given how difficult it's likely to be in the autumn. So I don't think it's right to say that the employers are kind of never going to go on campus again. But I think if we had to kind of make a guess, there's probably been a long-running trend for employers to be on campus a little bit less anyway. I think that this will probably accelerate that, and so I think it is quite likely that going forward there will be a greater amount of online activity. And from my point of view, one of the key questions will be whether employers are still requiring universities as the way to reach those student populations, or whether they're seeking to transact with them kind of directly. But I don't know what your thoughts on where universities are with this.
Yeah, so some universities I know have already made the decision to do everything virtual next semester, and either switch to a kind of virtual careers fair format or do something different and do something new. I wouldn't be able to put a figure on it, but I expect that we'll get more clarification on their plans very soon. We're doing a lot of work as AGCAS, and a lot of our members are doing work kind of helping our members make those decisions and make those plans. So I expect we'll have a better idea soon, but I know some have already made that call.
Great, thank you. Duncan is asking, what are your thoughts on the future of rotational secondments for graduates currently on programs and those joining? How will they be impacted, and what will they look like?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, rotational secondments are common but not universal in graduate schemes. So there are often, people talk about them. I can't remember. In our previous reports, we've got some figures on what proportion of firms use rotational secondments as part of their sort of development approach. I'm not sure that this will make a big difference to that. I mean, I think it's much more likely to have an impact on things like running, training days and other forms of, classroom-based, lecture hall-based type training and development. I think it's more likely to have an effect on that than it is on the idea that you shift from one workplace to another every 6 months for the first couple of years you're there or whatever. So, I mean, I don't know. We haven't asked about that specifically in this context, but it doesn't seem obvious to me that that will be one of the kind of most, one of the first casualties of the current situation.
Great, thank you. I think this is our last question. Hester is asking, were there any comments or insights on the in-module or work-based learning placements?
There were, but not very many, and not enough to include in the report. So I can't remember off the top of my head what those comments were, but I know there were a few. So that's something I can have a look into and follow up with. But it wasn't enough to be significant to write about in the report.
I mean, we know, so the survey gives us, in terms of the numbers, it gives us a sense of where, of the proportion of employers who are looking to kind of cancel placements and so on. I think what we know is that placements and internships have been very disrupted this year. People are obviously hoping that that won't be the case next year, but what we are hearing is that many placements may be likely to be shortened in some way. So that's one possibility. There's also the, people are examining what can we really put online, how much can we put an equivalent experience online, and how much can we only offer something that's really rather sort of lighter. I think those issues will still be being worked through. My guess is that, our figures tell us that there's been a substantial drop in the number of placements that will be offered. So I think we would expect, just on what we know already, for less students to be on placement next year. And it is very likely that, at least for some of those, the nature of those placements will change. So I think there are going to be some issues in the placement area, really, that will need to be thought through further.
And we didn't ask any specific questions about employers engaging with the curriculum in other ways, perhaps through modules or work-based learning. We just stuck to the kind of recruitment side, but it's something for us to explore further.
Great, thank you both. If you missed the beginning of our webinar, this session is being recorded, so feel free to share it with your colleagues who may be interested. Also, we have a few webinars in the pipeline, so keep an eye on our social media and our website for forthcoming online events. Thank you, Tristram, thank you, Gabi, and thank you to our audience for joining in. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.